Hi, this is Chris Dixon. This is the a16z podcast. I'm here with Benedict Evans. Benedict, let's talk about WWDC. Apple's big event is coming up in a few weeks. What's going on? What do you think is going to happen there? You know, what's going on? Also, Google I/O and just generally in the mobile landscape.
Yeah, so we have the focus of gravity in mobile has shifted from the handset conferences and the telecoms industry conferences earlier in the year to Apple and Google. So it's moved away from CTIA and CES and MWC to WWDC and Google I/O. And so in the next month or two, we're going to get these big kind of landmarks. And Apple and Google will both roll out a couple of tent poles and a bunch of nice incremental innovation, and they'll kind of they'll either set a direction and make some big strategic moves, or they'll just build on what they did last year. And
so typically, like for those of us who don't follow that closely, Apple will announce the new.
So they'll announce the new operating. They'll announce the new operating
without the hardware, and the hardware gets announced later in the year.
Yeah, the hardware generally gets announced later. It's possible if there's something that requires a load of new development effort that it might get announced at this event, but probably not. Like if they do a new Apple TV and it's got a big development story to it, then they might have to do it now.
So this is where they get the developers all energized to do to build stuff for the hardware.
Yeah, so you have a week of developer sessions where actual programmers can sit and talk to the guys who wrote the APIs and say, how does this work? How am I supposed to use this? So there's a bunch of incremental stuff that you'll care about if you actually use an iPhone. But then there's also the kind of the big moves.
The big moves that sort of set the stage. So where do you think we are now? So the iPhone is how many years now? 7 years old? 7 years, yeah. So we basically were in this sort of, the first era of the cell phones, right, where the kind of the crappy little clamshell handsets and carriers had all the power and controlled the software. Smartphones the iPhone came along, Android came along afterwards. We're now in the smartphone era where really Google and Apple kind of set the direction, and maybe Samsung. And so, where are we now in sort of that big picture?
Well, it feels, as you say, it's like the vision arrived 7 years ago and it's now been kind of built out and iterated and kind of done. And we've had notifications and
so all the basic, when it first came out, where's cut and paste, where's notifications,
all that stuff, exactly.
All those things, the wish lists have all been built.
Yeah, all that stuff's been done, and you feel like people are kind of slightly poking around, and both iOS and Android are now at the point that there's 3 or 4 really great features in each of them that half the users have never seen or don't know about because there's almost too much stuff.
So we're getting arguably to the overshooting point of sort of the Craig Christensen model.
But then you have this other question that, we've all been talking about, which is that on a smartphone, all the questions of discovery and user acquisition and how you get your app installed and what it even means to say an app, what the interaction model is even going to be, are still way up in the air. So, the web came along and that was the interaction model for 20 years, and PageRank came along and that kind of solved more or less how it was that you got users, or anyway, how you found stuff. And those are all still big unsolved problems on mobile. And so although, on one level, the kind of the OSs have been built out, the kind of the stuff that sits on top of it is still floating around and wide open and still a really big problem. And that's one of the reasons why you see over $1 billion in ad revenue on Facebook, which is mostly app installs, because that's the only thing that seems to work if you want to get users and you've got the money to spend. So I think
it's kind of crazy that Google, especially Google, being that ads are their business, haven't rethought these leaderboard models. It feels like such a primitive, simplistic model.
Well, it feels so. App stores today feel like Yahoo in like '96.
Yeah, it's like this list of
you've got a list, and
here's the new website.
You can browse every single website that there was, and it just that clearly doesn't work anymore. But it's not clear what the new answer is, and so you've got a bunch of like incremental improvement, like better plumbing. So app install ads and some sort of deep linking tools and re-engagement ads and so on. But it feels like that's kind of a halfway step. And then you've got people sort of groping towards new models with things like iBeacon and Now and Siri and the kind of cards models that Apple's been playing around with, and the active notifications that Android has, and the wearable strategy that Android has. And so people are kind of poking around the edges of what that model would be. And then you've got Facebook with this deep linking announcement that came out at their Facebook F8, their first developer event in years. And
just to explain this, can you?
So the Facebook deep linking concept is that you basically, in both iOS and Android, you have these sort of exposed linking systems but they're totally unstandardized, and you've got no idea if the app is there or not. And so it was always kind of half baked. And what Facebook,
so the use case here is I'm on TripAdvisor in their app, and I click on whatever Hawaii tickets, and it takes me to the deep linked page inside of the Expedia app or something, as opposed to just launching an app.
And so you see a really good example of this, ironically not using Facebook's system. So basically, Facebook had built this sort of central directory to manage all of these linking schemes. And so you can see a good example of what this might be in the new Google Maps, where you go to public transit, and down at the bottom after the buses and trains, then there's an option to order an Uber if you've got the Uber app installed, and it gives a guess as to what the travel time will be in Uber.
The deep linking thing is very interesting, because you'd suspect the deep linking thing would be the role of an operating system.
Exactly.
And so it sort of feels like a end run move by Facebook, who we don't think of as obviously as an operating system, smartphone operating system company, to start building operating system like features. And with Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, they're getting the kind of the clout on the home screen that they are almost OS level, right? I mean, like for example, they have to say they now have significant sway over handset makers with those incredibly popular apps and their ability to withhold them. And
you could kind of build like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for smartphone services, and think about where would Maps be, where would Snapchat be, where would Instagram be? Are those essential utilities? Are those self-actualization? Which parts of those does Google control? Which parts of those does the underlying platform owner control? And there's a story about Google putting apps onto iPhones and taking it from Apple, and you can argue about how important all of these things are. I think the puzzle around the Facebook linking question is, and this comes back to I/O and WWDC, is if you're going to kind of fundamentally change how apps talk to each other, shouldn't that be something that's done as part of the APIs that those apps are written in? If you're going to have like a systemic way, sort of grammar and a linking scheme to the way these apps can talk to each other, isn't that something that should be in the developer kit and be exposed
on one hand. On the other
level?
hand, you could argue, yes, it should be in the developer's kit. It should be in the spec of Android, for example. On the other hand, if some huge percentage of those links are coming from either Facebook, WhatsApp, or Instagram, maybe it should be coming from the guy who controls those apps.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's the question. I mean,
what percentage of the global links come from WhatsApp? Probably a ton.
It feels to me it's a bit like, it's a kind of a bad analogy, but it's a little bit like. I don't know, it's like the World Wide Web browser didn't actually have links. You had to actually type the URL into the page at the top, but you couldn't link to an external site. And then Facebook roll out some like widget that you could install on a web page that gives you a link to another web page. It's like that should be part of the browser. That shouldn't be something that's done as something that some people have to implement externally. And this kind of, again, it comes back to WWDC.
Yeah, but
you ask, well, what is Apple going to do? What are Google going to do? How does Apple take iBeacon forward? How does Google take Intents forward? How do they break apart what it means for an app, to say an app? And I think this is the kind of the question. If I was to say, as I've said this before, if I was to say in 5 years' time I installed an app on my smartphone, especially on my Android smartphone, I just wide open what any of those words would mean. Yeah. We don't know what Android is going to be in 5 years' time.
Did you see that XKCD that was like, I invented a new way to install apps seamlessly and across applications, and you invented web.
The other thing is like half the sites on the internet seem like they're reinventing Delicious in one way or another. I mean, all these ideas just come round and round and round with slightly different skins to them. But that's the this is this question, and just to round up the point about deep links, the kind of the problem with the apps model as compared to the web, it seems to me there's kind of two problems. One is that you can't link from within content on within one property to something within another property. But the other problem is on the web, it's there. You can write the link and the page will load. Whereas on a smartphone, yes, on Android, at least you know whether the app's there.
Well, that's one idea.
But how do you get the app onto the device in the first place? And actually, if all that deep linking really does is it smooths the user flow and it aids re-engagement. But actually, re-engagement is like a secondary objective. The first objective is to get the damn app on the phone in the first place.
Yeah, one idea I think people have for deep linking on mobile is to have what you might call kind of late binding in programming, which meaning you link to a venue app and then the venue name. So this restaurant I like, and then depending on whether I have Foursquare or Yelp installed, it goes to the appropriate app, right?
Yeah,
and so there's like a lot of ideas like that floating around.
Theoretically, you could do that as a third party, but it makes more sense to do it, I think, as a as part of the platform.
Yeah.
But then that circles back to, I mean, the thing this reminds me of is all the stuff around whether Siri should have an API, whether Google Now should have an API. It's very easy to do. It's very easy. If you're doing Google Now or Siri as a closed system, you can say, right, we're going to add sport, and you decide how that gets implemented. But if you're going to say, if you're going to have that open, then you've got all these kind of brokering questions. Like, I've got 5 sport apps on my phone. I've got 6 news apps on my phone. I've got 3 messaging apps on my phone. If I'm going to say, okay, send this to my friend, then it's going to give me a list of 5 different options. And that's the problem you have with Android Intents, which, it seems great in theory, but then you say, okay, I'm going to share this photo. And the menu you've got is kind of upload to Dropbox, print through Dropbox, share through Dropbox, upload to Instagram, share through, and you end up with 45 different options because everyone abuses the system. So, actually, it's one of those things where, like, the computer science part is easy, but the user interface part is really hard. What you're actually supposed to see on the screen is much more difficult than building it.
So let's go back to WWDC. Like, what do you have predictions or expectations or what,
as an iPhone user, I can give you a list of things that I think need to get fixed. There's questions around how photos are going to get better. The way the sharing panel and so on works is going to get better. We may see. I mean, how can I put it? Let me give you. Let's give you like
small.
Yeah, there's going to be. I can give you a list of small incremental things.
What about the big stuff?
The way that I think about the big stuff, or the stuff that Apple.
I feels like the big stuff is obviously like a watch or something like this.
Yeah.
Apple, big improvements to Apple TV would be big. New things like just brand new features, like the
what are the 5
tentpole
features?
I think stuff around iBeacon, by the way, seems like a really interesting fertile area.
So I think. Let me give you 2 answers to that. I think one is that there's a bunch of different reasons why Apple hasn't done any given thing. One of them is they've decided it's a terrible idea, like letting a third-party app read SMS. One of them is like they haven't had time, it's just not on a priority list. One of them is they've got this big multi-year project on a waterfall somewhere, and that's going to land this year, or it's going to land next year, or whatever it is. Like notifications would be an example of that. And I think the question for, I could give you 3 or 4 things where I think they kind of need to do X or Y or Z. One of them is around how apps talk to each other, which is what we've been talking about, how deep linking should work. Yep. Another of them is how apps get installed, how the App Store works,
like big ideas.
How those ideas would work. I think there's another thing around, and it's interesting you mentioned iBeacon, which is the thing that we kind of keep poking around, this cards concept, which, as we were saying the other day, means it's such a vague term, it means anything to anybody. But the use case...
Just to explain, there's a lot of... We just hear a lot of this sort of meme around here that various entrepreneurs talking about cards, sort of this idea that things you see in Google Now or on Twitter as sort of the new design metaphor to replace pages.
Yeah, but the question is that just a kind of design metaphor, or is it actually something that sits in parallel with apps and web pages? So if you look at what Apple did with Passbook, which is like this little experiment, you have something that's sort of running code, but isn't an app, and that can be installed, but not by going through the App Store. And so I asked the question, if I go into Starbucks 3 weeks after WWDC, shouldn't the iBeacon offer me a Starbucks loyalty card without me having to go online, without me having to install a Starbucks app, for example? And that's, of course, obviously the big problem with iBeacon is, at the moment, is, yes, it now, with 7.1, it runs in the background, so you don't have to have the app installed, but you still got to install an app before anything useful will happen with iBeacon. And it seems like there's scope for Apple to kind of play around with what it means to have the app on the device or not on the device. I mean, the other interesting sort of place one could speculate, of course, is around wearables generally, not just around making a watch. But if I buy a wristband or a camera or some wearable device of some kind, and I turn it on and the Bluetooth LE picks up, shouldn't my iPhone say, "Oh, you've got a fitness tracker, you've got a blood pressure monitor"? Should I have to install an app for that, or should it pull up automatically a card that drops into HealthBook, which is the thing that was floating around? Just as I get a loyalty card from Starbucks, or I get a restaurant review if I stand outside a restaurant.
What do you so talking about iBeacon? Like, what do you think the killer app is for beacons? Like, it seems like a cool thing. It's low power. You're walking around the city, and objects can talk to your phone. But what do you actually do? I mean, people talk about these ideas like you get a gift card. I mean, is that really interesting?
Well, I think for the phone to know definitively to the nearest inch where it is, if you want to do that, is interesting. And if I think back 10 years ago, we were talking about location in phones, and the only use case anyone could come up with was you walk past a Starbucks and you get a free coffee. And nobody thought of Uber or Lyft or Airbnb at that time. So once a phone has that degree of precision, I think other things become possible. The use cases Apple talk about is kind of store directories. Payments is another obvious example, because, you can hold the phone next to the till instead of rubbing it on something or pressing a pen. So I think there's lots of kind of ways that you can use knowing exactly where the phone is to close the loop in some way or do something useful or interesting. And of course, it's an open API, so anyone can do it. Anyone can make a beacon.
But you got a chicken and egg problem, right? Which is now you're going to have these installed, the iBeacon capabilities in all the phones. You still need beacons installed in the world.
You do.
And for those, you need some incentive for people to install them. So there needs to be some. Right? It's different than Uber and the smartphone, where users had the smartphone, they could give smartphones to the taxi drivers, and then the chicken egg problem is solved, right? Whereas here, like, step one, everyone has smartphones, check. Step two, the world is, has iBeacons everywhere. We don't have that yet.
Well, you put the beacons out, but then there's step three, which is people have to have the app.
Yeah.
And again, this comes back to.
But why are they going to put the beacons out? I guess what I'm saying, why are they going to put the beacons out?
Well, the question is, what are the problems that you can solve?
Yeah.
What are the problems that need to be solved by Apple or Google, as opposed to, which is why WWDC and I/O are interesting? What are the problems they have to solve that nobody else can solve? Yeah. Why would a retailer do this? I think you get into. That's always the chicken and egg question with any of these products. Why would you have a website? Why would you have a mobile site? Why would you make an app? Well, you think about ways that you can add value with that. We've sort of all had these conversations.
I mean, you hear these things like if you're at a museum, your phone will know about the piece of art you're looking at. Okay, that's cool. You're in a store, you get a coupon. I don't think the resolution works well enough for you to actually have a specific thing around a piece of.
No, you can do if you can tune it, so you can make it 6 inches.
Okay.
You can. I mean, the thing that Apple are doing. If you buy a new Apple TV, you can tap your iPhone onto the Apple TV, and it will set it up automatically with your iTunes password and the Wi-Fi password. So you don't need to. So you don't need to set the Apple TV up at all. And so they're using a lot of the. You can use iBeacon to do NFC in effect, but without needing NFC. So I think, again, the thing about. Is it a tentpole feature? Is it an incremental feature? I would expect to see a lot of stuff around iBeacon and how you can make that flow better and push that, because it's something that's very hard for Android to do, because Apple, Android, Google don't control the full hardware stack and the system's so fragmented.
I see.
So it's something. I mean, it's part of this.
To do. Okay.
I mean, again, there's this kind of mega trend going on here, which is that, and I almost should have said this at the beginning of the podcast, because Apple controls the whole stack, the stuff that's much easier for them to do than for Android to do, because the hardware environment on Android is so unpredictable. And so you see Apple pushing down the stack into iBeacon, into fingerprint recognition, into 64-bit chips, and all the stuff that the 64-bit chip enables with better camera image processing, all this kind of stuff, payments and so on.
The motion capture.
Yeah, the motion capture and so on and so on. And using the motion capture to improve battery life and stuff. And then in parallel, you see Google moving in exactly the opposite direction, because they have this incredible strength in cloud and machine learning and have no idea whether your phone has got a gyroscope on it or not. Google is moving up the stack, which is very hard for Apple to follow. And so you have this innovation moving in different directions. And so the thing that was really noticeable about I/O last year was, yes, there was loads of useful stuff in the new version of Android that they announced, but actually all the sex and all the tentpole stuff was about cloud.
Yep.
Whereas for Apple, the tentpole stuff is about stuff that you can only do when you control the whole widget. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where that emphasis goes.
So last topic, you think they'll finally announce the Beats acquisition at WWDC? When's that? What's up with that?
Let me sort of. We should get our.
They have to announce it.
Let's get our compliance officer on this call. Okay. I think so. The thing generally about M&A leaks, which is clearly what's happened. And, it's no discredit to the journalists involved. It's just, clearly somebody decided we're going to put this into the public domain. Yeah. Apple never does that. And generally when a deal leaks, it's because the person who's getting bought wants to bounce somebody or change the process in some way.
The big companies almost never do. They have compliance people, they're public companies. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they don't do this.
Yeah.
And there aren't that many people. The lawyers know, the acquirers know. Generally these leaks are deliberate. Yeah. They're deliberate by the company trying to get acquired.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the Beats story was you basically had two camps. You had the people whose worldview is that Apple is kind of fading away into irrelevance and has lost its mojo. And they looked at this and said, they're buying this company that makes overpriced headphones and has a brand and no technology. Yep. This is just proof that Tim Cook is a crappy CEO. Yep. And then people who don't subscribe to that view of Apple looked at it and said, well, there must be some reason why they're doing this, but I don't know what it is. I don't think anybody looked at it and said, this is the most fantastic idea, such a clever, such a brilliant move. Because, it's, if it was Samsung buying it, you could sort of see, well, it's branding and marketing, and it gets them, X and Y and Z, and, it gets them positioning with certain demographics. And, it's not really about the price. We know that, if the company's turning over...
2 weeks of profits for Apple. It's not the price.
Yeah, and if it's doing $1 billion in revenue, which apparently it is, then $3 billion may or may not be the right price. That's not really the point. Yeah. The question is, would Beats belong inside? What company would Beats belong inside? And you could make a case that it might fit quite nicely inside of Samsung, given Samsung's approach to the market. Apple... The best I could come up with was that they want a cheap brand to launch a cheap iPhone, but I don't feel like Beats is like the globally applicable thing for that.
I mean, the thing about it is Apple's brand is not cool. Apple's brand is quality, in my mind, right? Like, it's very different than Beats. Beats is cool, but not quality.
Exactly.
It's a very weird fit.
And all you'd get from it is you'd get a music streaming service that Apple could build themselves, and that clearly doesn't have any users yet.
That's very bizarre. I mean, plus, if they wanted that, you buy the leader, like Spotify.
Yeah, exactly.
Which isn't that much more expensive, at least according to
exactly. You'd buy Spotify.
And they have significant, it's like 100x users.
Yeah, they've got 10 million paying users and 30 million
active users.
And
they did buy for the legal contracts. First of all, I don't know if those agreements don't survive acquisition.
They won't be transferable, I
I don't think. And secondly, I'm sure Apple can cut those deals. That just seems silly to me.
Yeah, exactly. So the music service is neither here nor there. The technology clearly is neither here nor there. There's no technology there. There's no IP there. You're purely buying a brand, and you're buying a brand that's appeared out of nowhere in the last 2 years and is based entirely on people who go up and down in the lifts and might leave tomorrow. So it's like Sony buying Columbia, only worse. I mean, you almost feel like Apple looking at this and saying, please, Samsung,
it seems
buy
like a
this,
leak
please.
From Beats, and now it hasn't been announced. Dre seemed to confirm it on that Vine or whatever that was, that video, which was awesome. But presumably they would have, if they sign it, they have to announce it. I think. As a public company spending $3 billion,
you can't not announce a $3 billion acquisition, no matter who you are. So it feels like, we'll see what happens there. But I don't think anybody could come up with nobody looked at it and said, it's like a funny thing that goes on in the space. Like when Facebook or Amazon or Google do an announcement, generally people look at it and say, that's brilliant, but they might also say that's evil.
Yeah.
That's like the classic criticism of a Facebook, Google, Amazon move is that's evil and brilliant.
Yeah.
The classic kind of technology industry criticism of an Apple move is that's really stupid. Why nobody should do that? That's a terrible product. No one will buy that product. And people have been saying that about Apple for 30 years. It's bizarre. It's like somehow they continue to succeed.
And the other thing I'll say is that,
like a pathology of the tech industry there.
Having been involved in some acquisitions myself, like a lot of times the way it works is the company decides on secret plan to build X. They look at what they have to build it and say, we're missing, these other two pieces. Let's go buy them. And unless you know their secret plan to build X, you'd have no way to speculate, right? It just looks totally random.
Yeah.
And so maybe they have some secret plan to build something where Beats is on part of that product roadmap. I don't.
Well, I'm saying
I don't know what that is. Maybe it's a wearable. Maybe it's.
Yeah. Well, that was my point about the kind of the people who don't think Apple is doomed are saying, well, there must be some secret plan we can't see here, because it doesn't make sense to anybody just as buying Beats.
I think there has to be a secret plan.
Well, there's either a secret plan,
or it's all just.
Or it's that Beats went and shot themselves and Apple said, yeah, we'll take a look, and Samsung said, yeah, we'll take a look, and that's as far as it went.
Yeah.
I mean, if Beats went to Apple and Samsung and said, you want to take a look, they'd say, yeah, we'll take a look.
Yeah. Okay. We're out of time. Thanks.
Great.